Reparations for slavery isn't all about getting that bag. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee sponsored a bill to study reparations proposals in January.
Reparations.
Should Black people get reparations?
I think there has to be some form of reparations, and we can discuss what that is.
Okay, let's start by saying that slavery is a bad thing, have always been and will always be, no matter who does it to whom. But you must stop crying and try to make money from it. And yes, it's more for the money. Now you want reparations for slavery that happened more than 200 years ago. So let's examine history and see who owes who. The first owners of slaves were African kings and rich families. Most of the black slaves who were taken to the United States were slaves in Africa, and let's not forget that the first man who owned a black slave in America was a black man. So first of all, apply for reparations from the Africans and blacks who were the first owners of slaves in Africa and the United States. Now, when Muslims conquered Europe, they took white women and children to slaves. They sold them in Africa to Africans as slaves. So before the United States existed, Africans were the owners of white slaves. So you and the Muslims need to pay reparations to anyone who has European legacy. Of course, the Muslims also took black slaves from Africa. The truth is that they taught the white man about black slaves. Ask them reparations before the Americans. And in order not to forget, until now there are black slaves in the Arab countries, but it does not really matter to you because you cannot make money from it. Now, before all this, you know that Egypt is in Africa. So the Jews were slaves in Africa for 300 years, they suffered as no one suffered in slavery. The Africans murdered their babies in the most esoteric form, drowning. So anyone who has African roots should pay reparations to the Jews, and I speak mainly to all those who call themselves African Americans. Now, before slavery, black soldiers helped fight against the Indians and take their lands. What about reparations to Indians from the blacks? Do you think they deserve it? Buffalo soldiers, black soldiers, used military service as a strategy to obtain equal rights as citizens. They sought to achieve this by engaging in government-led wars meant to overtake the Southwest and Great Plains from Native Americans. Okay, after you finish with all this, we'll talk about reparations.
While there are debates about what reparations look like, one scholar suggests starting with acknowledging the atrocity, aka slavery.
The American Civil War was a war fought in the United States from 1861 to 1865, between the North and the South. The Civil War is the most studied and written about episode in U.S. history. Primarily as a result of the long-standing controversy over the enslavement of black people, war broke out in April 1861 when secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina shortly after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated as the President of the United States. The Loyalists of the Union in the North proclaimed support for the Constitution. They faced secessionists of the Confederate States in the South, who advocated for states' rights to uphold slavery. Intense combat left 620,000 to 750,000 people dead. Yes, you're right, no one is talking about it.
The fact that blacks make up 12 to 14% of the population, but own probably something in the order of less than 4% of the country's wealth, or maybe 3%, I think that's indicative of a material consequence.
I'll tell you why it happens. It's because most successful blacks do not want to give back to their people. They do not want to teach the other blacks how they succeed. Most of them prefer to support your nonsense and say that blacks cannot succeed because of the past, so they will not have competition, so they are constantly signaling, do not look here. The rest just get tired of your nonsense. They know you do not want help in succeeding, you want to get things for free. They know that even if they give all their money, they'll be rich again in a few years, and you'll go back to the same situation and start crying again. Try asking them for real help. Ask them to come and teach the black kids how to succeed and see the answer. Of course you will not do it, A. Because you know the answer. B. Because you do not really want help and you want to keep crying.
You want to know why that's crazy? I'll tell you why. Over $600 million, or just about half of the country's economic activity in 1836, came directly or indirectly from cotton.
Yes, and all this would not have happened without the factories that created the tools the slaves used, so those who work in these factories should get all the money. It's one of the dumbest things I hear from people.
Field Order number 15 was drawn up to redistribute 40 acres to the formerly enslaved. What happened to the 40 acres proposed to black folks, you say? Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson, a man who owned slaves, became president and threw the policy out the window. Let's talk about number 2, the guap, the cheddar, the dough, the shmoney, the quaint.
Like I said, that's what you really want. Now let me explain something to you. The Jews suffered much more than you, whether it is slavery in Egypt, riots throughout the world, the Holocaust, and to this day anti-Semitism. No matter what happened to them, as soon as they could they picked themselves up and did not cry all the time. Even after the Holocaust, one of the cruelest things in human history, they got up and started to build themselves. They did not let anyone forget, but they do not cry all the time. They do not blame all the Germans. Even the Holocaust happened less than a century ago. They do not play like they cannot succeed because of their past. The opposite, they prove that no matter what their past is, they succeed. They prove that everything depends on the person and not on those around him. If you still do not understand, I will give you a joke that will explain. A Nazi enters the bar, he sees a Jew in a corner, the Nazi stands and says, "A beer for everyone except the Jew." When he looking at the Jew picks up his glass and smiles. After a few minutes the Nazi again stands up and says, "A beer for everyone except the Jew." Again, when he looking at the Jew picks up his glass and smiles. For the third time the Nazi stands up and says, "A beer for everyone except the Jew." Again, when he looking at the Jew picks up his glass and smiles. The Nazi turns to the bartender and says, "What is wrong with this Jew? I invited everyone for beer except of him, and he is still smiles." The bartender tells the Nazi, "Mr. Cohen is the owner of the bar. Hope you've learned something and you've enjoyed. If so, you know what to do."